Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Caitlin. I did give a talk about this same project last year. So what I'm hoping to do is just kind of reiterate some of the points that we talked about last year, but also provide an update on how the project is going. So the big thing I always want people to remember is ForestSHARE. So it's an acronym, Soil Health Assessment, Research and Extension. So if you see that name around, or if you get a letter in the mail with that, this is who we are. And so I am not a forester. I'm a PhD student with the Faculty of Agriculture, but my background is in soil science. So I've been working on this project now for 1.5 years. But previous to this, I was the extension specialist at Perennia Food and Agriculture, working in agriculture. But then I also did a lot of forest soils research previous to that. Before I get into what we're doing, I just want to talk about the project partners. So we have some really important project partners, such as Debbie Reeves, as well as the Family Forest Network and Kevin Keys, Dalhousie, the Center for Sustainable Soil Management, as well as the Department of Microbiology. And then we're also working with DNR, NSCC, and Genome Atlantic. So this project is a large project, and my PhD project is a piece of that project. But there's a lot of overlapping pieces. So this is our logo, the ForestSHARE logo, and so the overarching goals of this project are: 1, to develop a suite of forest soil health indicators for Nova Scotia woodlots. And I was happy to hear some people talk about soil health in some of their previous presentations, so I'm going to dive into that a little bit more. And then we want to develop woodlot soil health management interpretation. So we want to find what these soil health properties are that are useful in Nova Scotia, how can we use them to improve or maintain our forests. And then we're developing a framework for a provincial extension program. So that's the overall end goal of this project. But in order to get to that extension program, there's a lot of things that need to be done. So my piece of the project is a lot of literature review as well as a lot of sampling. So in order to find these soil health properties that we want to evaluate, we're looking at a global search of temperate forests. So in the northern states as well as in Northern Europe, that's kind of the area that we're looking at. But then we're also collecting samples across Nova Scotia, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a few slides. But then we want to look at what properties are feasible for people to collect and what's actually useful. And then one thing that we've added this year is that we are looking at evaluating soil in the forest fire sites. So I was excited to hear some people talk about the forest fire sites, and we'll be specifically looking at the soil properties. So the reason why we have to look at all these different properties is soil health is kind of a broad term, and it encompasses a lot of different things. And it's much like human health, where you can't just measure it with a single property. You know, if you go and they measure your cholesterol, they can't say, oh, you're completely healthy, you might have a broken arm. Soil's kind of like that too. And then also soil health looks different for different ecosystems, different management plans, same as health might look different for somebody in their 80s versus somebody in their 20s training for the Olympics. So so there's a lot of different properties that we can use to measure soil health. There's physical, biological, and chemical properties, but so there are actually, I think, dozens and dozens of them, but it's not feasible to measure all of them all of the time. So that's why we're looking at them, sampling across the province and figuring out what's actually useful for woodlot management. So this is I won't read it out loud, but this is the technical definition in the Canadian Soils textbook, but the definition can kind of change depending on your site. So as I said, a single measurement cannot capture the complexity of soil health, and so that's why we're measuring a large suite of things, which I'll talk about in a second. And so I kind of talked about some of these points, but in addition to identifying what these soil health properties are, We have a list of what the soil health properties are that might be useful on your woodlot. Then we also are looking for a benchmark range or thresholds of what these properties are considered healthy or unhealthy for different forest groups in the province. So not only can we say, okay, pH is really important, here's the range of pH that you want to be within for your forest stand. So in order to do this, we are collecting, we're trying to collect 1,300 samples across 650 sites in the province. And so this is in combination with some sites that have already been sampled on Crown land through DNR. So this is just on private land that we're collecting these samples. And these sites are randomly selected, so we're trying to capture a wide range of forest types and soil types. So we have to randomly select them throughout the province. So there may be a letter that comes to you with ForestSHARE, because that's the only way we have to contact people, that is asking for permission to sample on your land. And I will talk about how the samples are collected, but we collect 4 measuring cups of soil. So it's very non-invasive. We do so using an auger, and it takes anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, depending on how far we have to walk. And then the only other thing that if you are a sampling point and you grant us permission, we might ask you for a little bit of history about your site on the harvest practices or any major disturbances that have occurred. So this is the original map of our sampling points. Some of these have changed. So every color represents a different ecosite, so different forest group and soil type. But this is the current map. So we've had 1 year of sampling, and unfortunately it was a tough year for sampling because there was a large part of the sample season that we were not allowed to go outside. So the pink here are the sites that have already been sampled. The blue represent the sites that we have permission to sample. And then the green represent the sites that we do not have permission to sample yet. Some of these are large private sites that we do have permission for. But yeah, so if you or your neighbor or somebody gets a letter in the mail with this project, this is what this is. We're doing research on soil health. So what we do when we get out into the woods is we identify the ecosite. So we have an ecosite in mind when we go out that we want ecosite 11, and we want this forest group and this soil group. And we identify what that is. If we can't find it at that specific point, we do go through the PID anywhere within that PID that we've selected, if we can find that ecosite. Once we find it, we use an auger and we collect the forest floor horizon as well as the B horizon. If it's a site that has a really fertile A horizon, so such as some of the more fertile sugar maple stands, we'll also collect that horizon instead of the forest floor. Once we collect those samples, so these are some examples of samples that were collected last summer, and basically we take 3 auger holes and make sure that they look similar, so that we're not sampling some like an anomaly or something within the stand, and then we collect the sample from there, and again we're collecting about 4 cups of soil. We may have to take some additional auger holes if it's a really rocky site or something like that, but it's a very non-invasive sampling process. Once we collect the samples, we freeze the samples and we deliver them to the lab. And these are just some of the things the lab are measuring for. So pH, nutrients, texture, aggregate stability, so how well that your soil is able to resist falling apart after a rainstorm or after some other type of disturbance. And then organic matter, different carbon fractions, and then microbiome information. And this is just some of the stuff that we're measuring. So we're also looking at some more specifics around how water moves through soil. But these are just some of the key properties that we're looking at. And through our research, we might find some other soil health properties that are valuable to add to this list. So I'm kind of talking fast here, so I'll slow down a little bit, but I want to leave a lot of room for questions at the end. So right now we had limited samples collected last year. Because of the fire ban, we did have a large sampling delay. But we do have a plan to collect these samples. So I am one of the samplers on the project, but we do also have other people that are sampling, other forest professionals that do some of our sampling for us in different regions. So we're trying to increase the number of samples that these samplers have to collect this year to try and catch up from last year. And the samples that have been collected are currently being analyzed by the lab. I was hoping to have some of the information, but they're still being analyzed. So one of the ways that we are catching up this year is when we were talking about soil health. It is difficult to look at a soil and say, okay, yes, the soil is healthy, no, the soil isn't healthy. Yes, the soil is healthy, but it's a little bit easier to potentially say, okay, the soil is not healthy, and compare that to areas that have been undisturbed. So one thing that we are looking at this year is some sampling in the forest fire sites, so particularly Long Lake and potentially Tantalon, to look at some different ages since fire. So we'll be collecting the same suite of soil health properties in these sites, and with the ability to compare them to the sites that are undisturbed that we've collected throughout the province. So this is just a map of the Long Lake site, and these are the different soil series. So we'll mainly be sampling on Gibraltar sites. And so one thing that was mentioned earlier is something that can happen to soil after a fire is what's called hydrophobicity, and basically the fire changes the chemical composition of the soil so that it's resistant to water penetrating through the soil. So these are some additional, there's a few additional soil health properties that we will be sampling, and hopefully being able to use this information going forward to better understand how these sites might recover. But yeah, this is exciting, and we are looking at two different fire severities. Let me make sure I say the right one, not intensity, but we're looking at two different fire severities and looking at the soil properties there. So that's an interesting new piece that we've added to the project. So overall, we're using this information. So our steps right now are, one, looking at global information of what soil health properties are used around the world. What are these benchmarks for these properties, and what's actually happening in Nova Scotia as a whole? And then are these properties feasible to measure for woodlot owners? Are they easily managed? And do they provide useful information for woodlot management? And then looking at some of the sites that have been disturbed, particularly by forest fire. And all of this will feed into a framework for woodlot owners to be able to collect their own soil samples, deliver them to the lab, and receive information about management, similar to how it's done in agriculture. Some other project outcomes that we're hoping for is we'll have a better knowledge of these benchmarks across the province. And then also develop a state of the forest soil health report by the end of this project. And so one question that I get asked a lot is, yes, we're kind of using the idea of how extension works in agriculture, but it isn't similar in some ways where it's, one of the main uses of extension in agriculture is nutrient management plans, where we can say, okay, this is how much fertilizer you need to spread and so on. That may look a little bit different in forestry, so these are just some examples of how we might be able to use this information. So improve ecological forest management, biodiversity and ecosystem services, species selection and productivity, harvesting and regeneration strategies, soil damage, hazards and mitigation, such as identifying areas that might be more prone to compaction or erosion, possible use of amendments such as lime or other fertility, and then also identify areas that might be more suited for additional carbon sequestration and climate adaptation. So these are just some examples. And the last thing I want to talk about, I have about 4 minutes left, so I'll leave some time for some questions. But with this extension program, this is the very early stages of the information that we need to develop an extension program. And so even if your site is not one of the sites selected, this project has the goal of, one of the goals is to benefit all private woodlot owners within the province, that this information will be useful. And so, like I said, the end goal is to kind of have information readily available that you can collect samples and you can get valuable management interpretations from that. But again, we are early in the program, so if this is something, an extension program is something that you're interested in going forward, we'd love to hear from you. So we do have a booth out there. It's the one with the laptop on it and no banners, but there is a sheet that just says, you know, if you're interested in an extension program going forward, then if you want to sign your name and email, and we can kind of give some direct information about the status of the program. But currently we're still kind of in this phase 1 collecting information. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about the program, or if you have any ideas for how the program might look going forward, we would love to hear from you. So the last thing I'll say is we do have a few new ways to stay connected. So we do have a new email, info@nsforestshare.ca, but if you do have our old email or any of our personal emails, that all goes to the same email, so it's all there. We do have a new website. I don't think it's completely done, but it's supposed to be done by the end of next week, I think. So nsforestshare.ca, we'll post some updates there. We often write some newsletters. And then there is an Instagram page as well, just with mostly pictures from the field. So there'll be a lot of updates there this summer. And I think I've got about 2.5 minutes left. So I want to thank everybody for listening. And if anybody has any questions, or if Debbie, you have anything you want to add?